The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents a debate review of Matt Dillahunty and Tyler Vela with Alex Malpass. Welcome.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going pretty good. This debate happened Friday. We're recording this Monday, and I typically, whenever there's a philosophy debate, there's a handful of people that I reach out to because I care about what they think, and oh my gosh, did I say this? Because quite often when I'm doing these things, and I'm not a philosopher, and I'm hey, I'll say all day long, I'm a dilettante, but I have a passion for some of this stuff. And I'll get into a conversation with somebody, and it's like, am I just a big idiot who couldn't explain things right? Or, were we speaking past each other? And so, you and Ozzy are probably the first two that I go to for a lot of this stuff. And I don't even think I barely finished the debate. And you had sent me a message saying, hey, there's some things we should probably talk about. So I figured I'd start with kind of like this shotgun approach of what my recollection of the debate was. And feel free to say, chime in and offer something on this. And then there's a couple things we want to do a deep dive on before we're done. And what struck me was the debate was supposed to be, is there good evidence for God? And so I wrote an opening fairly quickly, but I thought it included some good points about how we go about determining what is or isn't good evidence, and that an argument alone is not enough. If we're talking about evidence, we need some data, some facts. And I'm not necessarily saying that this has to be, a specific type of data or fact. It could be, it depends on the nature of the claim, which is something we'll kind of get back to. But his opening basically started with what I view as kind of like a flat denial of what we would consider to be the best epistemologies, by saying he's not here to appeal to logical positivists or empiricists, and instead is going to make a sort of abductive argument. And I anticipated this a little bit. So in the opening, I included a quick aside to talk about, well, first of all, one of the most important things was that for me, in order for it to be considered good evidence, this has to be data that is strongly tied to a discrete hypothesis. It can't be something that's prone to interpretation. It shouldn't just be loosely probabilistic, especially if they're talking about probabilities we can't calculate. And so when you come up with an abductive argument, you're arguing for the best explanation. So you put up all your candidate explanations, and you have to know roughly which one is more likely than another, specifically to the situation that you're discussing. And then you say, oh, well, yes, most of the time when we find an icicle laying on the ground, it's because it fell off of the edge of the roof or something like that. And, if we were to find one in July in the Sahara Desert, we might have to come up with a different candidate list of things. But it doesn't put us in a position where we can just say, you know what? I think God's just as likely, and God miracled this icicle here to the desert. There were points in the debate, and one thing I don't want to forget is his statement about saying that he didn't have enough faith in brute facts. And I don't know if the brute part of that had some significance that I missed, but it's like, I put most of my confidence in repeatable, testable, claims that are subject to review, and less of my confidence in anecdotal and testimonial evidence, because I know that people are flawed like that. But we got kind of a three-sup argument, kind of. I have a bunch of friends who, every time they run up against something that they don't really understand, they just say, oh, I was debating a precept, when it's not really presuppositional apologetics. Mm-hmm. But this was tied to that in a way, because essentially the foundation of his argument was the laws of logic need some grounding, and naturalism cannot come up with a grounding, has not and cannot, and therefore he goes to God. So I was going to get your thoughts on that stuff before we dig in on like stars aligning and things like
all right, where should we start then? Because there were like 3 or 4 different things there.
If you had a specific thought on the brute facts thing, because that just stuck in my head as maybe there's something really significant here that I'm missing and would like to know.
Okay, so I mean, generally, like a brute fact is a contingent fact, right? So one that could be otherwise, which has no explanation for why it's this way rather than a different way. So it's not necessarily going to, well, so you were talking before about like whether you prefer facts that have like certain kind of epistemology, like that you can verify, there's some repeatable tests you can do or whatever, right? As opposed to ones that you might hold on faith or something. Well,
Right.
with a brute fact, I mean, like let's say this glass of water, there's an explanation why it's got this much water in it, right? It's to do with something that happened a minute ago with me turning a tap on and whatever, taking so many sips out of it since then and stuff. So there's some explanation of why it's this full and not some other other degree of fullness. Um, if it was just that it was that full and there was no explanation for it, um, you couldn't do a test to tell that it was like that, rather than just that it was, be qualitatively indistinguishable from one where you just didn't know how to test for it. It was just something where you don't have enough information to determine why it was like that. So if we just stumbled across it, you might just never be able to say what the causal history was that led up to it, and you just wouldn't know if that happened to be a brute fact that it was like that or something. So it does present a kind of problem for that. What you want to do is be able to verify, test, and understand the explanation for something that with a brute fact you'd never be able to determine its bruteness. And I think, like, so I don't think you're a logical positivist. I don't really think that's got anything to do with the debate, apart from the fact that Tyler said it so many times. But I think that so general, like, sort of, let's call it a sort of scientific outlook or something, but like what you want to do is try and explain as many things as you can, right? And generally speaking, that's a methodological approach that you would take to stuff. So you wouldn't just come across something that you don't have an explanation for, like right now, and just go, oh, that must be another brute fact. I found like 50 already today, right? Like, you wouldn't approach things like that. You would probably say, well, I don't know what that is. Let's try and find out, right? Like, that's the sort of just inquisitive attitude. Now, a brute fact might be resorted to, right, as a last ditch, right? Like, maybe it's a brute fact, but I think you'd have to have some like pretty compelling reason to think that, right? You'd have to have exhausted even what you consider to be possible ways of explaining it differently. So, I mean, for instance, people don't just posit like glasses of water being brute facts, but you might posit that the beginning of the universe was a contingent event that had no explanation for it. I mean, you might do that, but if you had some philosophical argument that meant that you couldn't, there was no alternative or something, you wouldn't just sort of like happily adopt it as a brute
Right.
fact. And I don't think that's what you would do either, right?
No, and actually, so this is what I've gone kind of round and round with, because I accept that the identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, I accept that these are true. I'm convinced that they are. I'm maximally certain that they are absolute and inviolate, just because, but this is more of a pragmatic thing. It's not that I have faith in the brute fact that they are true. It is, I have no way to offer a grounding or show that there even is a grounding behind them, that they may in fact be a brute fact. But whether or not they're a brute fact, which remains to be shown, somebody could, I'm accepting, make a case that they not only do have some grounding, but that they've discovered what that grounding is. But until such time as we get there, and I don't think we've done the first step to say that they need to have a grounding, I at least accept that they are true and demonstrable and useful and all that stuff in the exact same way that he does. The only difference between us, I mean, this is one of those things where for years now I've just said, yes, this is a presupposition. I take this not quite as axiomatic, which is kind of how I would view a brute fact, but pragmatically axiomatic, that I'm going to use these things as long as they continue to demonstrate this. And I'm happy to say these things need a grounding just as soon as somebody shows that there's a path to finding that out. Because until then, I think I think the people who are claiming to have a grounding are just really uncomfortable with the fact that they don't have a grounding and are desperately flailing around to find one.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the question of grounding and bruteness are slightly different questions. So, I mean, presumably you think that whether or not the, say, principle of non-contradiction is true, it's not contingent, right? It's necessarily true if
Right.
it's true at all, right? So if a brute fact is a contingent fact with no explanation, then doesn't, then the principle of non-contradiction doesn't qualify in virtue of it not being contingent, right? So we might say that it has no grounding, but you wouldn't necessarily, necessary truths, right, don't have explanations anyway. Like, why is it necessarily true that 2 + 2 = 4 rather than 5, right? You shouldn't expect there to be like a deeper explanation. All you can do is sort of just look at maths in general and like understand how it works. But actually, at some level, it's all just has to be that way and it couldn't be another way, right? That's it. There's nothing really further to say about that, right? It's not like an explanation in terms of, well, this happened and then that thing followed it and now 2 + 2 = 4. There's no explanation in those terms, right? It just has to be that way, right?
So he's basically arguing that non-contradiction, et cetera, must be contingent, and I'm just pointing out that I don't see them as contingent.
No, I don't think he thinks that they're contingent. I just think that all I think he's saying is that that I think this idea of bruteness is just kind of confusing. It's just a term that's not being used in the correct way. I think all he's trying to say is that they don't have a grounding, right? They're not like made that there's nothing a deeper level of reality or something that they like depend on for their existence. Right?
Except
but
something depend on God's mind.
Yeah, but so what he means by brute is that you would just say, well, they're just true, but there's no deeper level of reality on which they kind of depend, right? So, but he's saying in his view, there is a deeper level of reality on which they depend, which is the mind of God or something, right?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get to. That in his view, maybe I'm using contingent wrong. In his view, they're contingent upon the mind of God, and in my view, there's no demonstration that they're contingent on anything.
Okay, and so then this is a classic, like, two uses of the word contingent, right? In one sense, contingent means could be otherwise, and in another sense, contingent means basically dependent.
Dependent,
It depends on something else for its existence. So yeah, so he's saying that the laws of logic are contingent in that sense of dependent, but you both agree, and you're saying, I don't know if they are, right? Maybe they are, maybe they're not, but you both agree they're not contingent in the sense of could have been otherwise. I mean, everybody agrees the laws of logic couldn't be otherwise, yeah.
Except for one thing and this came up a little bit during the debate, which is if in fact they are the product of God's mind, then that opens a question of whether or not they could be otherwise. Like, could God actually change them? Now, the people who are arguing for this, including Tyler, want to kind of talk out of both sides of their mouth here by saying these things are absolute and inviolate, but they're a product of God's mind, which means that now God can't change his mind. God serves as this foundation. And I'm like, as soon as you make these things a product of a mind, how did you rule out, or how does that do anything to make sure they're more absolute? And if God can't change them, then isn't God now dependent upon them?
Yeah, so this can be really difficult it's a difficult terrain to explore. But I mean, I guess it doesn't necessarily mean, just because something's a product of a mind doesn't necessarily mean that means that they could change. I mean, if the mind can't change for some reason, then whatever its products are can't change either, presumably.
Right? Yeah, but so it would only be a problem, I suppose, for a God, because if I have a mind that if we went with like a strictly deterministic, my mind couldn't have been any other way. The God they're proposing isn't constrained by those things, and so it becomes a question. And I suppose he's a Calvinist, so he may also accept that God has this limitation as well. And yet there are others who would say that if something is a product of God's mind, like the laws that God writes in our heart about morality, God could fundamentally change what morality is, at least within divine command theory, even though under the God's nature theory, I suppose perhaps God can't change his nature.
Yeah, it does become, if you say God could just change the laws of, say, logic or morality, then obviously that makes him pretty weird. And I think it means, on most people's understanding, that they're not going to be necessary truths. They're going to be contingent in some sense, right? Like it's possible that they'd be different if they could change. So presuming, I don't know, but presuming, it seems to me the standard view is to say that God's timeless, doesn't really change. Although he does change his mind and like smite people and stuff in the Old Testament. It's a God of the philosophers, right? He's timeless and doesn't change, right? And he just is some way. And there are some philosophers who say that God being like that, right? If he has thoughts, then they're always the same thoughts, and that they could basically play the same sorts of roles that abstract objects would, right? So you could just say that God's thoughts are abstract objects, and that
Yeah, I think
view is
it's into confusion when we talk about, for example, the God of classical theism or philosophy's God compared to a character in like the Bible or the Quran that has
yeah.
jealousy and anger and motives and things like that. They don't quite line up, which is
Hmm.
also a frustrating disconnect when you have someone who's arguing for this abstract minimalist God as a grounding for logic, who then wants to do this leapfrog to Jesus immediately, which Tyler kind of smuggled in at one point. I'm not going to fault him for it. That's his job. I mean, as an apologist, you're there to share the gospel. There's one other thing I kind of want to touch on, and then I want to let you dig in a little bit on the stars aligning, and that is we kind of talked past each other a little bit and didn't make much headway on the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I think it was worthwhile to point out that saying a claim requires sufficient evidence is pretty much a tautology, and that what I was trying to explain is that not all claims are created equal, which is also kind of like at least obvious, if not worked into a tautology at some point. I wanted to do these characteristics. There was a point where I was like, can God make himself testable by science? And he almost, it was funny watching it. He almost fell into a trap that I wasn't even laying, and then realized he would be excluding the very manifestation of God as Jesus if he did so. So he kind of realized what was happening. But it wasn't a trap I was laying. I'm sitting here saying, here's how I'm not a logical positivist. There are claims which are subject to scientific investigation, factual claims that are empirical in nature, that are about what is in the universe. And then there are other claims which aren't going to be subject to that sort of investigation. He touched on some of them where, he's like, well, we have linguistic proofs, and we have, these synthetic kind of thought experiments. And when we're talking about abstract ideas and concepts and things like that. Cool. All I was trying to do was set up those two categories to show that I'm aware there's more than one category. I'm not saying that I'm not advocating for simple scientism, although I don't really have a problem with scientism in some regards, but I'm not advocating for simple scientism. And then it's a matter of determining which category God fits in. And if God can make himself subject to scientific testing, then why hasn't that happened, et cetera? And if God can't, okay, then we're talking about something else. And you don't, then it becomes, can God manifest in reality? And how do you know about God's characteristics? And how do you know what God wants? And can God inspire a book? And you go down a big rabbit hole there. But as soon as I offered up those two, there are things which are detectable and testable by scientific methods, and there are things which are not. Now that is a direct logical negation. That is the simplest Venn diagram. And because he suspected a trap, I don't want to pretend like I can read his mind, he agreed to offer provisional assent to that, and it completely derailed the point I was making, because how the hell can you sit here and talk about identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle as if you understand them, and then when somebody presents two direct this is an exhaustive diagram I made here, not just boobs, an exhaustive diagram, and then you want to offer provisional assent because context. And I'm sitting here, as soon as he said because context, I'm like, hang on. The whole point of identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle is that they tell you nothing about context. They are context agnostic. They are just, here's A, and everything is A or not A, no matter what and I even gave the quantum mechanics example that I get all the time. And so that was, I did that for anybody who knows, was that along the right lines of saying, no, I'm not a logical positive. There's two categories, and no matter how many times you call me that in order to dismiss me, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, oh man, the logical positivist thing was making my head hurt listening to it, because it was just like, I mean, the logical positivism is so like the basic kind of like, okay, so Hume, right, as this Hume's fork, right? So everything that's knowable fits into two categories, right? Either matters of fact, right, or relations of ideas. That's how he puts it. and then anything else that's in between those two things, he thinks should be consigned to the flames, for it be nothing but sophistry and illusion. Right? That's the cool Hume quote that everyone knows. But what he's saying is two ways that you can know things. Right? They're either basically what we call like a priori or a posteriori, the things that you can experience, or they're things that are just like relations between ideas, like abstract things that you don't need any experience for to understand. Um, and that logical positivists took that, but what's going on with them is that they are in a period of philosophy that's come to be known as like the linguistic turn, right? We're going to start doing philosophy of language, because actually logical positivism, it's a claim about meaning. It's not a claim about what you can know, right? They're saying there's two types of meaningful statement, right? One reduces to statements about observation, and the other one reduces to statements about logical relations. So basically Hume's fork again. It's claims about matters of fact or relations between ideas. But instead of just saying things in between there, you can't know them, they say things in between there are meaningless, right? Literally meaningless. So they used to go to philosophy conferences, and whenever a philosopher started to present a paper that was about metaphysics, they would literally shout M, right? Really annoying troll habit, like M meaning metaphysics, as in that's all bullshit. You can't talk about that. So they reckoned all ethics, aesthetics, philosophy of religion, all that stuff was just meaningless, right? It's such a radical position. But you don't hold that. I've never heard you say anything like that. I mean, sure, just said a minute ago you've got some tendency towards scientism, but it's not logical positivism, right?
Yeah.
That's a claim about meaning. It's not a claim about just I think my epistemology like prefers observable facts. Right? That's not logical positivism. Right? It's just to confuse two different things. So anyway, you're obviously not a logical positivist in that sense. I mean, if anyone's interested in that, and they should go and read like A.J. Ayer. Basically, that's your kind of cookie cutter introduction to logical positivism, and that's the one everybody kind of cliches and kicks the crap out of. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Oh no, we're almost at the point where I wanted you to we're gonna have some fun digging in on this stars aligning thing. But you also mentioned something earlier about Nagel that I thought you might want to expound upon.
Right. Oh yeah. So okay. So Tyler's argument was, the one bit of the argument was like he said, well, um, so so he said they used the example of Thomas Nagel, who had written a book that Tyler's obviously had a read and a think about, and his synopsis of Nagel was that Nagel said that naturalism as a project was dead and that it couldn't account for a bunch of stuff, which is not an unheard of critique in philosophy. Right? Lots of people critiquing naturalism, that sort of thing happens a lot. And anyway, so he was saying, it doesn't account for things like ethics or like inference, stuff like this. So, I mean, also people like Derek Parfit say similar things, right? I mean, it's not an uncommon thing. Anyway, and then Tyler's idea was that Nagel just dismisses theism. Apparently, in Tyler's view, Nagel conceded that theism would totally account for all of these things, but it just has to be dismissed for just by a pure prejudice or something. It couldn't be there. And then all he was left for, this kind of like last resort, last chance saloon thing, was to postulate like that there were sort of Platonic objects or something that could play this role. So you
Yeah,
just
he
have
went
to
down this
say,
Neoplatonism route.
yeah, so he called it Neoplatonism. Um, it would surprise me if that was the way that Nagel labeled his own view, because Neoplatonism is a name of a view from like, I don't know, the second century or something, which names uh, a, a view associated with a guy called Plotinus. But I mean, there was a bunch of famous people. I think Philo of Alexandria was also a Neoplatonist, and it's a weird view, and I don't think that's what Nagel was talking about. It'd be very surprising if that's what it was. I think what he just means is Platonism, as in not Plato's theory, Platonism with a big P, but it's kind of contemporary Platonism. So you just say there are abstract objects as well as like concrete objects. There are things like numbers and maybe laws of logic, stuff like that, propositions, possible world, stuff like that. And okay, if so, then it's not that radical as a philosophical view. But then he said, well, look, it's just incoherent on its own terms, right? To imagine that the law of logic, that the law of non-contradiction would be a thing that exists on its own is conceptually incoherent. And his reason for supposing that was that, how could it causally interact with the world such that it would impose upon the world that there couldn't be any contradictions, right? How could it like make my cup not suddenly be not a cup, right? How is that
Right.
like abstract object making that happen? And that's weird, isn't it? So it couldn't possibly be that. I mean, okay, just a very quick pause. I I very much doubt that Nagel construed it in terms of causation. I mean, maybe he did, right? But like, it's true. That would be kind of weird, right? That's not normally how Platonists construe the idea of like an object instantiating an abstract object. I mean, if that there's one object here isn't being caused by the number one to be one object. I mean, Platonists don't talk like that. That's not how they talk, right? Instantiates oneness, but it doesn't mean it's causing it to be one. That would be weird. I mean, maybe that's what Nagel said, but probably that's not what Nagel actually said. But let's say he did, right? And that would be, I guess, okay, I'm willing to concede that would be a weird view, and I wouldn't know what it meant to say that. But then Tyler switched over to just saying, but there's a timeless, spaceless mind, right? And that is just what embodies logic, right? That's a law of logic is just like a bit of that mind, like a thought that it has or something. And he's going, yeah, but we all understand how like agents can cause things, so that's fine. And it was just like, I mean, whoa, whoa, a minute. Like, I understand how agents that are physical can interact with things, right? Because like it's an exchange of energy, there's blah, blah, blah. We've got physics, stuff like that. That makes sense. But I don't understand how a disembodied mind affects physical things, right? That's the same mystery, it seems to me. And it's called the interaction problem. And it's like well known ever since Descartes posited that there was a completely separate substance. People started putting their hands up going, hold on a minute, how does a completely separate substance interact, right? What are you talking about? So it's not like it's not problematic to say, I mean, if causation is the issue, right? And abstract objects can't cause things to be, you know, non-contradictory, then how is it there's just a mind doing that? Like, what's the relationship there? It's the same problem. He said, oh, it totally solves a causation problem and moving on. And it was just like, no, it doesn't. It doesn't even begin. It's the same problem. You just stated the same problem. He's posited a different type of disembodied object that's somehow doing this thing you just said couldn't possibly be done by the other thing. That's like, we're owed an analysis there, and there was just nothing. So, I mean, sometimes he talks about it, not in terms of causation, as like God's mind is causing the world, but the it's a reflection of God's mind. And I mean, I just don't know what that means, right? That's just
it'd almost be good if they'd start with something that got closer to, like the universe is an emergent property of the mind of God type thing, except that now you're still talking about, I don't necessarily know how that works. I know my internet connection hiccuped for a second. I actually had a weird flashback a minute ago when you were talking about it's not like as if the concept one instantiates this glass. I had a flashback to a caller from yesterday's episode of the Atheist Experience who was trying to make this argument that math was not descriptive but was prescriptive, and that this would prove that there was a mind of God. And I was and so your example there is one that I'm probably going to cling to if that person calls back, because it's But I definitely want to get to this thing here, because you mentioned that you had a couple conversations on this and you published a paper recently, and this is something that comes up over and over again. And for the people who are who are watching this who maybe haven't seen the debate or haven't seen the other discussions in this area, I'm going to nutshell part of this, which is for years, when people would ask, what would convince you that a God exists? Quite often people would come up with glib examples, and I would too, as if there were writing in the sky that said this. And I remember Lawrence Krauss and Richard Dawkins were on stage at, I believe it was an Imagine No Religion conference, and I was there. And I had recently completely changed my mind on this because of a realization I'd had. So now my answer when somebody says, what will change your mind, is I have no idea what would change my mind. I don't have the necessary intellect and understanding to assess the nature of the question to determine what sort of evidence would be sufficient. But if there is a God, then that God would know exactly what should change my mind and should be capable of doing it, and therefore it's not my problem. And I still like this answer. I think it is about as intellectually honest as it can be. Maybe it's because I don't know enough. Maybe somebody else knows more and they can teach me. So I pulled Krauss aside afterwards, and I explained why I no longer gave that answer about, riding in the sky. And it gets back to, any sufficiently advanced technology problem, being indistinguishable from magic. And I really thought I was going to get some pushback, but to Krause's credit, the instant I explained it, he's like, "Oh wow, yeah, you're right. I'll change my answer the next time somebody asks."
Oh, nice.
And I was like, "Great, that's what should happen." And if it turns out later on he reflects on it and is like, "No, that's actually a boneheaded answer, and here's why," he can come back to me and explain it, and I will do the same thing. The people who are terrified of changing their mind, but this writing in the sky showed up in the debate, and rather than rehashing everything that I'll people go back and watch the debate, because I wanted to get to your thoughts on this, because when I was hoping in the debate that I would finally have a better way of explaining this, that maybe I was having a conversation with someone, because I will say, to Tyler's credit, while I'm not sufficiently versed in philosophy to pick up on all the things that you did, I would never put Tyler in the same category as like Cy ten Bruggencate, because
No.
Cy is kind of parroting what he heard from Greg Bonson, and I don't think he has a good understanding. There are things that I'm not convinced Tyler has a good understanding of, but it's undeniable. I think Tyler has a better understanding of some things than I did. I mean, it's just, you're better read in a particular area. So this is not let's bash on Tyler at all. But I was sitting there thinking, wow, even though there have been problems in this conversation, I might now have the opportunity to get this point across and get somebody who disagrees with me vehemently on things to grasp and see this point. And it did not quite go that way. So let's get your thoughts on the stars aligning, because I'm interested in how you process this and the paper you wrote.
Oh, well, so the paper I wrote isn't on this. The paper I wrote is on divine conceptualism. So it's about how abstract object could be ideas in the mind of God. And I was showing more problems with that. So I could keep talking about that for ages. So don't let me get back on that, because we can talk more about that if you want.
Set that one aside and go with the stars.
Yeah. So for this, I was talking with a friend of mine about this the other day, just because I know I watched some rando YouTube video of someone making the argument, and I was like struck by a thought, and then I had a little exchange with a friend of mine who's good on this type of like probability assessment-y kind of way of looking at stuff. And so it sort of clarified at least the way I think about it. So I'm not saying this is completely right, but look, here's how I see it, right? Like the idea was like this. So Tyler's trying to say, look, for you, nothing could count as evidence that God exists, and that's a problem for your epistemology. Now, just putting a pin in that immediately, I think that's not really fair. I mean, like it might be that the hypothesis is not well formed, right? In which case, it's not your epistemology that's bad. You certainly can't just tell straight away which one is at fault there, like the hypothesis or the epistemology. I mean, something's wrong, right? But that's all that it tells you. Anyway, so coming back to it, he was saying, on your view, you wouldn't believe anything that counts as evidence of God, even if, and then here's the kind of slam dunk, like this must convince you that the stars in the heavens rearranged themselves and spelt out something like, Matt, this is Yahweh, why don't you just believe in me, or something, right?
Sure.
Now, like, so the thing to think about, it seems to me, with this is that it's not a prediction that the theist hypothesis makes, right? Like and that's why it's not clear what to make of it if that happened. So what I mean is something like this. So let's say my hypothesis, right, is that the coin is rigged, right? Like I've got a coin in my pocket and I'm thinking it's weighted on one side, right? That's my hypothesis. And now I'm going to flip the coin loads and loads of times. Like obviously if I flip it 3 times and it comes up heads every time, that's not very good evidence of anything, because that could just happen. But let's say I flip it like 1,000 times and it's just 50-50 at the end. So it's basically 50-50. There's no pattern that shows anything, right? Well, the thing is, my hypothesis made a prediction. It raised my expectation of something, right? Like I was expecting to see it more weight. I should have seen more heads or more tails, right? 50-50 is not what I was expecting to see. So my hypothesis of it being rigged had a certain expectation, and the evidence, when I looked at it, disconfirmed that, because it showed me something else than I was expecting to see. Right? It doesn't completely rule it out, because again, it's chance. That just could have been rigged anyway, and it just happened that it blah blah blah. Right?
You
but it does
in times, and maybe you find a set of 1,000 that's 50-50. But yeah.
Yeah, right. Or maybe I flip it a million times and it's fair, but it lands a million times heads up just by chance, right? Like, I mean, it doesn't completely rule anything in a route, but what it does is it raises or lowers my confidence in the hypothesis. So that's what evidence is, it seems to me, right? Like, it's, if I've got a hypothesis that makes a prediction and I see that happen, then that raises the probability. If I, have a hypothesis that makes a prediction and I see that that doesn't happen, it lowers the probability. There you go, right? That's basically Bayesian epistemology in a nutshell. Um, and well, so let's just look at the theistic hypothesis, right? Like you might say, well, obviously, you might say the theistic hypothesis predicts that that would happen, but I'm going to try and suggest to you that it definitely doesn't, because the thing is, there's no counterbalance. Like if I look out the window right now and I go, it's not spelling out anything in the sky right now, right? Does that disconfirm a theism? No, it doesn't. Right? It doesn't give you any reason to think that theism is false. A theist wouldn't see that the stars not aligning lowers their probability that theism is true. They wouldn't think that, right? And that shows you that it's not a prediction that their theory's making, right? Their expectation level is exactly the same in theism after looking and not seeing it there. So then you've got to think, well, why is it? Why would it be confirmatory if it did show up in the sky? You can't have one without the other. You can't have something happening being confirmatory of a hypothesis, but it not happening, not being disconfirmatory of a hypothesis. In fact, they've got to be in proportion to each other for it to be perfectly rational, right? So if it makes no difference if it doesn't happen, it can't strongly confirm if it does, right? That's not how this works. And this isn't logical positivism. This isn't like anything. I'm not suggesting. I'm not saying the only way to know things is through science. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying the only way to state meaningful sentences is if they reduce to observation sentence. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm just saying, well, I suppose I'm saying that basic framework of the Bayesian epistemology, the vague, not filling in any of the details, just idea of like proportionality with expectation and whatnot. If that's not right, I mean, Tyler was objecting constantly to he was straw manning what your position was by telling you you're a logical positivist or whatever. But he never really explained what his alternative was supposed to be, right? Like, as if, is it just doing induction or abduction is the alternative? Because I just think I just think realistically a logical positivist could do an abductive argument anyway. Actually, I don't want to like be too mean about it, but I don't think that's an alternative epistemology, just doing an abductive argument. But anyway,
I would think
yeah,
that by and large, everyone would agree that a deductive argument supported by strong evidence would be at the highest tier. And then inductive arguments supported by strong evidence, which is basically what science does, would be at the next tier down. And that an abductive argument supported by identifiable probabilities and likelihoods would be at the next tier. And then below that would be abductive arguments where you're just essentially pulling stuff out of your butt, where you have no
well,
way of knowing how likely something is, would be and he just like skipped past everything to get to what would be almost the lowest of the ones that could be considered at all. What I find funny about the star thing is, and I agree with you. This is not on theism. We would expect this, and we look out into the night sky, and it never happens. And yet, curiously, and this may be a slight cheap shot, but it feels like it gets to the heart of one of the problems with regard to the difference in epistemological standards of theists and atheists, or particularly some varieties of Christians, is despite the fact that we have the entire history of gazing up in the stars and not seeing that sort of thing, we have a couple isolated incidents where someone sees a pattern in the stars and then interprets some meaning from it, where you get to astrology and things like that. Or what's worse, an even worse case than that, is we have a story about a star that stood still and led someone to Jesus, and they're willing to accept the entire story. And so here's essentially a message in the stars, which is nothing more than a single star as a guiding light. And I wonder if a story like that they have to take as real, or real-ish, I suppose, for some people it may be, metaphorical or et cetera. I wonder if that leads them to this notion of, well, you wouldn't even believe writing in the sky, without even realizing that when it doesn't happen, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't disprove or falsify their hypothesis.
well, I don't know, because I'm inclined to say that very intelligent Christian philosophers who have a fantastic grasp of, rationality and the type of stuff I was just talking about then, Bayesian kind of basic weighing stuff and proportionality, whatever. That there's no like atheists are good and Christians are bad at this type of thing. There's some people are really great at it. It has a lot to do often with education levels and the privilege, frankly, to be able to sit down and go through it and whatever. And like most people don't have that, and it's
I think I'm talking more about this possibly being a bias towards a foregone conclusion. Like what I see from some apologists is they become convinced of a God because of a personal experience or whatever the reasons are, and then they reason towards it after the fact. And we all have this bias. Like you're talking about,
we all do, yeah.
Good apologists, like Blake knows more about Bayesian analysis than I ever care to, and is a genuinely sharp guy. And I don't think he would go this writing in the sky type of thing that somebody else does. And it was just kind of like a passing thought of, yeah, you're correct. The absence of writing in the sky doesn't in any way falsify their hypothesis, which means that the presence of it isn't something to be expected.
Yeah.
But this example keeps coming up, and it ties in, at least sometimes, to the same people who are like pointing to the one star that led to Jesus thing. And maybe I'm just conflating stars in my head, but
well, look, I think that one of the things you can, I think, fairly say is that if a theory is vague and doesn't really make any predictions, then it becomes impossible to either confirm or disconfirm it, right? And I think that's the way you look at it. You're saying, well, I just can't see how anything could be confirmation or disconfirmation of the hypothesis, right? Just what could happen that would do that. So what am I supposed to say, right? And I think unless, you have to kind of stick your neck out at some point when you're in the business of like advancing a hypothesis and like say something that's risky about it, right? Like, so take the classic example of like Einstein's theory or whatever, where his theory predicted that a star that was like would have been behind the sun would be visible because the light would be bent around it because of the curvature of space-time around a gravitational body, right? And so in an eclipse where they were able to do that like measurement, they were able to see that there was a star that should have been hidden and it was there. And it was like, if it wasn't there, that would have seriously been bad news for his theory, right? And the other theories on the block didn't think it would be there. So it was a prediction, right? It was actually a prediction that you could go away and test and see whether it come out. And it doesn't have to be that every prediction is like something you look through a telescope or a microscope on. But I mean, because the example with the flipping the coin is not sort of science or something. It's just like rationality. It's just normal. Like if you've got if you've got a prediction that makes you expect something, then that thing happening is good for the theory, right? That's it. It doesn't have to be particularly complicated. But if you've got a hypothesis, it doesn't make any predictions. Like if I say, well, maybe there's just like a ground of being that just is, and like everything would be exactly the way that it is now if that ground of being was there, then I mean, like, I don't know, maybe that's true, right? But how can I be any excited about that theory, right? Everything would be exactly the same if it was true as if it wasn't true. So like, it's not my fault that I don't know. If someone said to me, what would make you believe in this ground of being, passive ground of being theory? And I'm saying, I don't know, it doesn't make any predictions. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? Like, it's not my fault that it doesn't, it's vague. And if your, theism hypothesis is like super non-committal and it never makes any predictions about anything, then yeah, it's hard to ever rule it out, but it's also hard to find anything that confirms it. So, I mean, if it makes a prediction like these guys who reckon the world's going to end on a certain day, when it doesn't end, that is bad news for their theory, right? It doesn't necessarily destroy it, but it certainly disconfirms it. So if you've got a type of theism that never does anything like that, then it's hard to, it's hard for average schmucks like me and you to know what to say about it. Like, that's why. It's because it's not putting its neck out and actually risking being verified or disconfirmed by any actual experience or evidence or anything. So, I mean, that's the problem, it seems to me. It's a vague hypothesis.
It's probably one of the reasons why I'm... So I spend a great deal of time. I spend more time actually arguing with atheists lately about bad arguments and things like that, because I'd like for our side to have the better arguments and fewer fallacies and less hyperbole. But it's pretty obvious if you go back and watch some of the conversations that I've had, particularly with deists, about my level of frustration with deistic arguments. That essentially that people are saying, well, I believe there's a God, and it doesn't intervene in reality in any detectable way, doesn't care about anything, doesn't do anything. And I'm like, not only are you essentially claiming that you've identified the unidentifiable, your definition is something where you would have no evidence for it, and yet you're pretending that your position is justified. But your God is completely useless. It is a proposition which is the existence of that God is indistinguishable in every way from our perspective from its non-existence, and yet you're touting it as if, as if you've come. It reminds me of, and I will not name an individual specifically, the hardline agnostics who, rather than having a conversation about what people actually do or don't believe, are so concerned with the label and what people know that it's just like, no, you're not an atheist, you're an agnostic, and you should say you're an agnostic. And it's like I am, depending on your definition of knowledge. We can have that discussion. I'm agnostic, and on some things, depending on definitions, I'm not. I'd much rather talk about, here's a proposition. Is there good evidence for it? Which is what this debate was supposed to be about. And what I tried to address with a little synopsis in my head, because I love alliteration. The opening that I came up with for this particular debate will live in my head forever as footprints, feathers, and fallacies, because it talked about the footprints, horses versus zebras versus unicorns, minotaurs, centaurs, and that process. Then I briefly mentioned the Dumbo's feather fallacy, because if somebody wanted to give personal testimony of what had been done, the fact that they think they couldn't have got out of alcoholism without a God, that is Dumbo's feather. I don't think I can fly without it. And then specifically fallacies gets to, if we're going to construct a syllogism, it would be nice if it started off as a valid one without formal fallacies. And then we need to add to that premises that, first of all, as I've said before, and I don't know if you and I have ever dug in on this, the thing that I keep trying to correct people about is that in a valid syllogism, true premises necessarily lead to a true conclusion. But we may not have access to truth. And so the real key is, do you accept the premises? If you accept the premises and the structure is valid, you must accept the conclusion. Otherwise, you are being irrational. Even if the conclusions are ultimately wrong, even if we don't have any way to know they're true, it's like, maybe it's wrong that the sky is blue, but if I accept the sky is blue and that's a premise, I don't get to then say, well, I'm not going to accept the conclusion in a valid syllogism. I think people focus too much. And granted, I'm sitting here wearing a t-shirt that says I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. And I still hold to that. It's just that it's not that truth is something that is necessarily easily identifiable or maybe even attainable. And maybe the best thing we can ever do is have consistency. And, like science doesn't make proclamations about truth. It just says, here's our best current understanding of all the available evidence. Here's the model that seems to account for it best. And we'll revise it when we get other information. Maybe that's as close as we can ever get. I kind of derailed there away from stars in the sky, but sometimes I do that.
Well, yeah, that sounds right. When it comes to logical arguments, they're normally, if it's just logic on its own, it's not really interested in what the content of the argument is, right? The thing that's true doesn't really matter, right? Like, just call it P and the other thing Q or whatever, and then the structure of the argument is what's interesting for a logician. So yeah, I guess, when it comes to like whether stuff's absolutely true or not, I'm not that interested, really. It doesn't really matter that much. But then it feels like we're talking now more about kind of Site and Rugenkate version of Presup, where, unless you have absolute truth, do you know that absolutely, that kind of like, silly way of thinking.
For the people who hear that and think, oh, Alex isn't interested in truth, I'm pretty confident that you and I are both interested in what's true. It's that we're recognizing a limitation. We're recognizing things like an absence of a solution to the problem of hard solipsism, the imperfect nature of minds, and that, you know, if I say it's true that I have a Coke Zero that I got from Wendy's for lunch, I have much more warrant for that belief than you do, and yet we would probably both accept that under you know, conformist views of truth and in general, it's just true. But this notion that there has to be some absolute truth or absolute certainty, both of us recognize, okay, not only are we probably not getting there, I don't see any path to get there, and I don't really care because I'm still stuck dealing with whatever reality I'm in.
Yeah, I mean, you can't be interested in every philosophical question, and some of them the other people find very exciting. I'm not excited about at all. You know, I never really particularly interested in the philosophy of mind. You know, I mean, I kind of understand how other people are. It's sort of interesting in a way, but it's also like I'm not. You know, I'm more interested in philosophy of mathematics than I am philosophy of mind. Other people find that terribly dull, and I completely understand that. But that's how I work. And to me, this question of like, can we ever know something absolutely true completely or not? Like, I just don't really care that much about it. I mean, it doesn't keep me awake at night.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's a couple of other things I wanted to say about this debate.
Please
do. Now we're talking about something different. It's
you can get us right back on track. You can add anything else to the stars thing. You can talk about whatever popped in your mind about the debate, and then we'll wrap it up and I'll get back to work.
So instead of talking just directly about like philosophy, but more about like the debate itself, it felt to me like Tyler was quite keen to shadow box with versions of you that he imagined, I felt. So saying that you were logical positivist or whatever, and it felt like and he sort of rehearsed an argument against Nagel. And it was just like, but what's that got to do with you? Like, you're not saying that. So what difference does that make? Like, let's say Nagel was wrong about that. So what? Right? Like, you could just agree with that and say, okay, so but that's not an argument against me. So there were a couple of things where like I felt like it would have been better if he'd dropped his guard a bit and just had a conversation. And I don't know, maybe I just don't really like debates that much these days, you know, because sometimes it's, you know, it's not really communication. It's kind of like a practiced art of miscommunication, of kind of talking over each other and talking past each other. And it would be nicer to have, you know, just two people like this, just having a chat about stuff, and then the ideas you can just like think about them, and you know, it doesn't. If you said, "Oh, you got that wrong because you said it wrong and it should have been this way around," I'll say, "Oh yeah, you're right. I got that wrong." It doesn't matter. If someone's in a debate, then they're like guard up, trying to like win or something, and it's like it's not a helpful way of going. So maybe that's all. Maybe that's all that was going on there. But I would have just preferred it if he'd been more prepared to just sort of like listen to what you were saying instead of assuming that he knew what your position was right from the beginning. That annoyed me.
I always prefer the conversations, and I'm trying to move debates more and more that way. There were a couple times where, and I'm not going to remotely claim that I didn't do some of the same problematic things that he does. I think it's a pattern that we just fall into. But there were a couple moments during the debate where, like, first of all, I genuinely wanted to understand this throwing the tennis ball at the dog thing, because
I had no idea about that.
He seemed to really think this was an important analogy, and I was genuinely trying to understand it, and I don't think I ever really got there. There was another point where during his opening, he actually, I mean, I wrote the words down just as he was saying them, where he was like, God creates identity, non-contradiction, the laws of logic. And that brought up a question in my mind of okay, this isn't just like, in other cases, when people are arguing for God as a grounding, it's usually tied to this is God's nature. God is morality. God is logic type thing.
Right.
When it said God creates, I thought, okay, let me see if I can get clarity on this. And then rather than him saying, well, he just went straight to, I didn't say that. And I'm like, okay, maybe I'll concede. Maybe I misheard. You've listened to his opening twice. I'm pretty sure that he said God creates. And
you know what? I don't know. That's a good question. I should have.
He
made
said,
sure I figured that out.
Whether it was a slip of the tongue or whatever, it's it's like he's in this position where it's like, no, I didn't say that. And my take on it is, you know what, if I said that, I misspoke, or here's what I meant. It's like people, when they show up for debate, it's frustrating enough when they show up with they've watched a whole bunch of things that I've said, and so they've written down things that I've said, expect me to defend everything I've ever said, because I've changed my mind on some things and I've refined the way I talk about some things. If I hadn't, in 15 fucking years of doing the show, that would be very sad. It's even more frustrating when, instead of coming with anything I've said, it's just, well, Nagel says, well, you know,
Quine
says, well, as if I showed up to defend everyone they've ever read. And the truth of the matter is, while I'm more conversant with Hume than anybody, and I make no excuses about that. I've even said before, kind of half joking, even though it pisses off some of my philosopher friends, that Hume's all you need to read, and after that, work the rest out for yourself.
I think Hitchens said something like that once as well. So fair enough.
Then I'm in good company. I should find that Hitchens quote. Although, it's not that Hitch and I agreed on everything, but showing up as if I'm here, it's like they have this almost Neoplatonic ideal of what atheism is by grabbing the bits of atheist philosophers and thinkers that they've disagreed with, and they come in and they set this package in front of me saying, please defend all of your other cohorts. And I'm
like Frankenstein's monster or something.
It's like you can't even name. Well, I've sat on stage with Dawkins and Harris and Krauss, and I disagree with all of them about something. I'm not here to defend their thoughts. I'm here to tell you what I think and why. And I don't know that I've ever shown up at a debate armed with quotes, even from the person that I'm engaging with, let alone armed with quotes from other theists. Now, I might talk at some point, if I'm in a debate about a particular doctrinal point with, Matt Slick or somebody, and say, well, what you're talking about goes back to, well, I did mention Alvin Plantinga's modal-logic ontological argument, but I just like saying that, like that actual that Alvin Plantinga's modal logic ontological argument just is fun to say, no matter what it is. There's something
that's acceptable. I think that's fair. Yeah. So right. I had thought of another thing. Tyler had said that you'd picked it up as him saying that God created logical principles, right? And he backed away from that. And I mean, that would be kind of weird, right? Because at least it invites the idea that maybe stuff, what happened before he created them, right? Creation is normally a thing that has a before and an after. I mean, maybe it doesn't in this case, but at least makes you think well, what was going on beforehand? But then it doesn't seem right, because well, if before there were logical principles, why wouldn't it be true to say, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal? Would that not be valid? What happened? What did you have to do to make that valid? It doesn't seem like it depends on anyone doing anything. So it does seem weird to say that someone would do something and then that would be valid, whereas before, or absent them doing it, it wouldn't be valid. I mean, it's just mysterious. Well, what sort of thing are you talking about, right? So, I mean, I think that's why I backed away from it. But then it just leaves the question of but what is it that's the relationship between God's mind and logic principles, on Tyler's view? What's that supposed to be? So there was this kind of question mark there. And what some views would say, that God has thoughts, and that some of those thoughts are propositions, the law of non-contradiction or whatever, some other proposition. Now, to me, the problem with that is that a thought, right? So this is another thing that Tyler said, was that laws of logic are thoughts because they're rules of rational thinking and stuff. And I think what was going on there was he was conflating a logical law with a sort of principle of rationality or something, and they're just not the same thing, right? A logical law to me is something so the principle of non-contradiction just says, well, one way of looking at it, it says that there are no propositions such that like P, such that it's true along with its negation, right? That's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it would be you'd say for all objects and all properties, if an object has a property, it doesn't lack that property, right? Like, so you could make the statement about objects, or you could make the statement about propositions if you want. But in either sense, what you're doing is you're saying of a general class of things, they're like this, whether it's propositions or objects or something. Now, it might be that what's happening is that, and so like to say that a law of logic is a rule of thought just seems like it's different from that. Like, I mean, it would be good if that's true. Let's say that one of those principles is true, right? Like all propositions, they're not true along with their own negations. I mean, I damn well, if that's right, then my thinking is going to be good if I incorporate that in my thinking, right? It's going to be bad if I don't, because it's just something that's true that I'm not incorporating into the way that I'm thinking. I'm going to go wrong if that's not the way I'm thinking about stuff. But it doesn't mean that it is in itself a principle of thought. It's a principle of propositions being true and not along with their own negations. That's not a principle of thought as such, right?
I might be wrong, but a lot of this gets down to, and this, maybe I'm just really remembering the call from Atheist Experience yesterday, but it seems that I have a couple different ways that I love to express identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle. My favorite is just to draw the single circle simplest Venn diagram, because I think it gets to the obvious, but another one that was more linguistic that was fun to say was everything is what it is, isn't what it isn't, and nothing is neither or both. Except that I don't think that's that clear. It's just kind of like almost a limerick type thing to say. But it seems to me that the difference is that I view those as descriptive, and Tyler and others view them as prescriptive, whether they're a product of God's mind, created by God, or something that comes from God as an emanation.
Yeah. Right.
They still view it as prescriptive, like thou shalt not both be and not. And no, and maybe that's why this prescriptive view, there's ties to there needing to be some grounding, whereas yes, it's uncomfortable, but only in a mild sense to me, that we don't have a grounding for logic, because I'm willing to accept that if these in fact are descriptive, the grounding is in, oh boy, you get into trouble with language here, because I was going to say like the nature of things or the thing, because that makes it sound contingent. But as you and I both know, I don't view it as contingent in either sense there. This it doesn't bother me that I don't know what the grounding of that is, only because I'm convinced that it is possible and perhaps likely that there is no grounding, that because these things I view them as descriptive, could not be any other way. The notion that they could have been, or that they needed something to say, thou shalt never violate this rule of excluded middle.
I mean, I think it's such a hard area and weirdly popular with presuppositionalists. But like the metaphysics of logic is super, super hard. There's hardly anyone really doing any philosophical work on that. I mean, there kind of are, but not in these like really broad, basic kind of ways of looking at things. Philosophers of logic are normally doing logic, right? It's like deep into the detail of logic and like different systems and implications and blah, blah, blah. And often there's metaphysical things going on in that, but just like the idea of like what is logic, there's not actually a huge amount written on that. But wouldn't be unfair to say that no one really knows, right? It's just like the finest minds throughout history haven't really given a good answer for that, right? It's just one of those weird things that no one really gets yet. And it might be that we're dimly, just about grasping the outlines of something deep and interesting that's a different aspect of reality that will somehow, maybe 1,000 years, have a better perspective on, and look back at this and think these idiots on YouTube fumbling around for an answer for that question. They had no idea about like the 17 extra dimensions we've now figured out, and that abstract objects are some reflection of some real thing that's over there in a different dimension. I don't know. No one really knows, right? But the point is that it feels to me, I'm relatively comfortable in my ignorance about that, on the periphery of different views all the time without having to decide between any of them. Like, it feels to me like they could, logic could be in some way a limitation of my own imaginative capacity, right? Like, it could be a fundamental thing about cognition that we just cannot process contradictions. Like, that might be a thing, it's like a blind spot or something. We just, like, as if there was a dimension in front of you that you couldn't see for some, you know, weird dimensionality restriction that you've got in front of you, but it really is there. I mean, it might be that like two things being superimposed on each other at the same time, you just couldn't actually visualize that, and you just see one of them and not the other. I don't know. I don't know whether that's a limitation of my cognition or not, right? It might be a principle of metaphysics that everything is consistent and never superimposed weirdly like that, and that's why I never see it. Or it could be that, like, God's mind beams some controlling force into the world that sort of glues it into consistency instead. Or it could be some other stuff. I don't know. There could be loads of other things that are going on, but really no one has a good grasp on that. And that makes it a weird candidate for an abductive argument, right? Because it's not like, you know, there's this person dead in the library and there's a candlestick with like fingerprints on and we have to decide who did it. Like, it's not like that type of thing. Like, there's three candidates and it's got to be the butler or the scullery maid or something like that. And really, we just don't even know whether these are candidate explanations or if they're just bullshit. And, you know, any of those explanations I just gave then could be any of those things. So
it's why I had such a problem with trying to go down. Like, I'm not a big fan of abductive arguments in the first place, but the more vague we get and the less we have any strong demonstration of probability or likelihood, then the worse they get. And in this case, it was about as weak. You know, I honestly wish that I enjoyed getting high, because what you just said, I would love to get high and just sit around and think about it for a while, and that would be fun. But I want to get this wrapped up and put out there. Thanks so much again for your time. We should definitely do this again and more often. I always learn something. Hopefully the viewers learn stuff and figure out, hey, here's where Matt got it wrong. Here's where Matt didn't quite get it right. Here's, you know, because the first thing I heard from several people was how frustrating this particular debate was. Now, I did not find this one nearly as frustrating as some others. There were points of frustration, but there were some people who were like, oh, my eyes glazed over as soon as Tyler started talking. And I was like, I can understand that, for the same reason that you and I have different passions about areas of philosophy than other people do. Some people, as soon as they find out it's going to be a philosophically dense debate, they're like, fuck that. I thought this was supposed to be about good evidence for God. You know, why don't you show up with a bone and analysis of a bone type thing? But no, I greatly appreciate your time. And I know when Ozzy gets back from camping, he and I are going to have a conversation about this as well. And cool. And it's one of the reasons why I'm optimistic, because when I enjoyed the debate with Tyler, despite points of frustration, because I felt like I learned some stuff and I got closer. Once or twice, I felt I got really close to something. And so it's nice to have you guys around to touch base with, to make sure that A, I'm not crazy, B, I didn't screw it all up, and C, here's some things you missed that other people are going to benefit from. So it's a big help to everybody, and I appreciate your time greatly.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Cheers.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.